understanding as utter freedom. Shiva is freedom. The Shiva Sutras identify absolute freedom as the nature of Shiva par excellence. In other words, the supreme liberty of the absolute consciousness is the essence of this consciousness. In this metaphysical context, freedom involves two main aspects, which are lack of constraint on the one hand, and infinite creativity on the other hand. The first character implies that there is nothing external to Shiva that could either limit, compel, or contain him in any way, which ultimately means that everything is Shiva. The second aspect, the aspect of infinite creativity, which is in fact intimately connected to the first, points to the dynamic and productive nature of the Absolute that Shaivism always envisages as ever-flowing and unending multiplicity of new forms. Manifestation is in the nature of supreme consciousness, and this principle, when fully understood, should silence any question as to the why of existence and its myriad of forms and contents. This is so because, in essence, the realm of finite reality is none other than Shiva himself, the supreme consciousness, that both manifests and binds itself through its Shaktic vibration and projection. This dynamic and creative process through which the absolute consciousness outpours into multiplicity is highlighted in the central teaching of the intrinsic union of Shiva and Shakti. While Shiva is pure consciousness and light, Shakti is characterized as the intrinsic and efficient power of self-revelation of Shiva, through which Shiva manifests, supports, and reabsorbs the realm of manifestation. In this sense, Shakti is none other than Svatandriya, or the intrinsic freedom energy of Shiva. Shakti is the inner dynamic reality of Shiva, and their intimate unity is more powerfully asserted as we consider the essence of the ultimate, while their latent duality, although more and more perceptible as we descend the stage of the limitations of consciousness by and through manifestation, is nevertheless ever transcended by Shiva's sovereign infinity and unending ability to affirm himself in and through the negations of himself. In other words, even though Shiva negates himself in and through Shaktic manifestation, this negation is nothing else than an affirmation of himself through negation. Shiva, in other words, always reconciles all oppositions because he is, with and through Shakti, the very productive source from which they emerge and into which they flow. In Kashmiri Shaivism, Shakti is the principle, therefore, of universal relativity. Without Shakti, there is no relativity. Since it is through her that everything is brought into existence. She is the inner dimension of Shiva that actualizes and exteriorizes his freedom to be all that he can be, that is, everything. While being eminently affirmative and dynamic, there is somehow a vantage point from which Shakti could be considered as a kind of negation of Shiva. And this somewhat negative aspect of Shakti appears inasmuch as Shiva, being infinite and undivided reality, she cannot but appear in some respects and on some levels as the principle that brings out the finite and discrete realities that delimit and divide, so to speak, the Shivaic plenitude. In that sense, Shakti is within Shiva the seed of the principle of negation, limitation, division that allows for the unfolding or outpouring of Shiva's infinite nature on the level of finite realities. However, and that's important to stress it, Shaivism is not intent on attributing this negativity to Shakti itself, or herself rather, but rather to the lower ranges of the process she treats. Indeed, as principle of projection and manifestation, Shakti needs to be considered on a plurality of levels. Thus, Abhinavagupta's foremost disciple, Ksemaraja, distinguishes three levels of Shakti, which are Parashakti, the Supreme Shakti, Para-Para-Shakti, the intermediate Shakti, and Apara-Shakti, the inferior Shakti. These three levels subsume no less than 34 degrees of projection of consciousness, or tattvas, from Shiva himself as pure I to Prithvi, or Earth, the utmost limit of condensation and materialization of consciousness. The Supreme Shakti, Parashakti, while pertaining to Abeda, or non-difference, also refers to the level of pure consciousness that is already the seed of the process of production. At the second stage, that of Para-Para-Shakti, we enter the realm of that which would be most satisfactorily referred to as relativity, both in the sense of a field that takes us away from pure consciousness, and more specifically, in that the relationship between subject and object, unity and diversity, is most emphatically present therein. This is the domain of Veda, or identity and difference. On the third level of projection of Shakti, or Apara-Shakti, we move forward or downward from the realm of duality in unity to that of a multiplicity increasingly abstracted from unity. It is the realm of difference, distinction, or Veda. It ranges over 29 tattvas, or degrees of Shakti projection, the highest source of which is Maya, or more exactly Mahamaya, the great Maya. With the latter, Maya, we enter the domain of Veda, or difference, or at least its emergence, the latter being associated with Mahamaya and the former with Maya. This is the level of maximal objectification and thereby diversified exteriorization of Shakti. It is the realm of multiplicity, fragmentation, and nonce, K-N-O-T-S, where the underlying unity of consciousness has become most difficult to perceive and realize. The relative balance between I and Vav is broken as the scales are tilted on the side of objectification. In other words, on the highest level of Shakti, there is no objectification, or there is only the seed of objectification. Everything is immersed within the divine subject, within the Shivaite plenitude, the Shivaite fullness. And as we come down the levels of Shakti manifestation, the polarity, the polarization, even the opposition between the subject, subjective consciousness, and objects grow thicker and thicker, as it were. So in this perspective, what is evil? Well, evil is nothing but the outcome or the manifestation of the ignorance of the all-encompassing and all-powerful reality of absolute consciousness and the fragmenting objectification of reality. Evil is not positively defined in any way. It is envisaged by the tradition merely as is shadow in relation to light. In fact, evil as such is very rarely, if ever, mentioned in Kashmiri Shivaite treatises. Although ignorance, impurity, separation, and obstruction can be deemed to be various manifestations of evil, the latter, human evil, can only be considered as consequence or reflection of metaphysical and spiritual principles. While Shiva can also be considered as the destroyer of evil, it is only in the sense of a dissipation of darkness as a symbol of ignorance of the light of pure consciousness. Anything evil is ultimately referred to a sense of separation from that light, which is in fact the only reality in a true sense. While Shaivism does not consider evil as a substance in any way, it considers, however, impurities as obstacles to the recognition of supreme consciousness. In fact, impurity cannot be understood without reference to consciousness. In Mark Diktovsky's work, quote, impurity is a state of seeming separation from consciousness. As a separation, impurity requires a discipline of union that reabsorbs the separated elements into the unity of consciousness. As a seeming separation, however, this reabsorption can only take place when the integrity of consciousness is reasserted in the permanence of its unflinching reality. In Kashmiri Shaivism, the notion of mala refers to impurities that are the spiritual roots of any kind of evil. These malas pertain to Maya, which is identified with the first covering of consciousness. or the individual delusion that prevents the full manifestation of the pure I-ness. According to the contemporary Shaiva master Swami Lakshmanju, these three manas refer in ascending order from the grossest to the most subtle to the domains of action, thought, and being. The impurity of action, the first one, karma, is connected to the feeling of pleasure and pain and their alternation. The second type of impurity, maya, which is based on the experience of Binavedaya Prada, that is the sense of difference between I and the other. As for the last impurity, anamala, it is defined as the feeling of being incomplete, of lacking something. It is the fundamental sense of lacking being, a feeling that is at the basis of any desire for things and experiences. As I indicated earlier,